Now let's look at GRUB2. Unfortunately, GRUB2 is not quite as easy to make changes with as legacy GRUB. But GRUB2 offers us a great deal more functionality, and it's actually much more powerful. So when we make changes to the GRUB configuration, when we're using GRUB2, you need to make those changes in one of the files located in etc grub.d or etc sysconfig grub. Now, most of the time, it's been my experience that we find we can change most of what we need in etc sysconfig grub. You can make changes in etc grub.d, but those are script files, and that scripting can get pretty intense. I definitely recommend that you take a look at the GRUB2 user manual on the GRUB website if you plan on working with files in etc grub.d. As well, the various variables you can use in the etc sysconfig grub file can be found in the manual. Now, once we've made changes to the GRUB configuration, the actual configuration file, which for biosystems is etc grub2.cfg or etc grub2-efi.cfg for EFI systems, has to be updated manually. And we do that with the GRUB2 make config command. Now, if you don't want to use the scripts, you can edit the etc grub2 config file manually, but it's not recommended. Now, as you can see, I'm logged into a CentOS 7 system, and CentOS 7 by default uses GRUB2. Now, if we look at etc grub.d, you can see here are the various files that you can use to adjust GRUB's configuration. As I mentioned, unless you are unafraid to get into some fairly heavy scripting, it's probably easier to make the changes that you need using the file in etc sysconfig grub. And here you define variables that are used by GRUB to build the GRUB configuration file. So for instance, if I wanted to change the default scheduler from its current setting, which is no op, which means no queuing, no scheduling, to the completely fair queuing scheduler, I can do that here with the elevator kernel flag. As well, if I want to disable more verbose booting, I can add the quiet flag. Now, the different variables that are available for your use are enumerated in the GRUB2 manual. Again, I suggest you take a look at that because it's a great source of information if you find you need to make changes to your configuration. Now, previously I mentioned that one of the nice things about legacy GRUB is that you make your changes to the configuration file and you're done. They're applied at the next reboot. The only problem with that is that if you make an error or you make a mistake, it's very easy to render your system unbootable. GRUB2 doesn't completely solve that problem, but it does make it a little bit harder to shoot yourself in the foot. So once you've altered the GRUB configuration, you have to regenerate the GRUB config file with the GRUB2 make config command. And as we look at the help output for that, you'll notice that there's a TAC-O option to output a file. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to rebuild our configuration and have it output to etc grub2.cfg. Now, you'll notice that etc grub2.cfg is a link to /boot grub2 grub.cfg. Again, GRUB provides the link, in this case probably for convenience. So now that we've rebuilt our GRUB configuration file, having made our changes, we can reboot. Now we can see what scheduler has currently been loaded by examining our syscontrol variables. Depending on what variables are enabled, we should be able to determine which scheduler has been loaded. We can also look at different information related to this by checking out proc, schedule debug. And we can see here that the scheduler in use is the CFS, or completely fair scheduler, which is also what we specified in our GRUB configuration. So those are the steps. You modify the script files or the variables in etc sysconfig grub, and then you run grub make config and you reboot. Now, alternatively, you can build grub2.cog manually. And if you choose that route, I definitely recommend that you use the GRUB2 manual on the GRUB software website as your guide. So that concludes our demonstration of how to amend the GRUB configurations. Remember that with Legacy GRUB, it's very easy to shoot yourself in the foot. Not quite as easy with GRUB2, but still very possible. This is George Scott with Linux Academy.